let's see if, wow, that's awesome. It actually does record. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, are folks seeing the PowerPoint? Do we have anybody in here who needs interpretation? ¿Hay alguien aquí que necesita interpretación en español? I don't speak any of the other languages. Okay, I think we're good. So welcome everybody. One of the things that I was thinking about when we were thinking about training for our parent ambassadors not too long ago was that we often talk about advocacy and do introductory advocacy training. And then we don't really think about all of the pieces and parts and work that went into something and the ways that we need to think about ourselves as permanent advocates, like ongoing advocates, like not just getting involved when there's a big campaign, but figuring out how we can make it work after that. And if it didn't work, then we need to figure out what the next step is. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in the context of Fair Start, because it is an example of a really big thing that we were able to get past. And you know, you might think that you know, that this was like a big activity from the last 2 years, but it was a lot more than that. So for folks here in this group, you know, when would you say that the advocacy for all of these things that we have included in the Fair Start bill, the expansion of eligibility, the expansion of the copay conversation, the additional support for salaries, all of those things, when would you say that started here in Washington? At least 2012. Yeah. If not sooner, yes. I did not actually start my timeline in 2012, but you're absolutely right. All of these things have been talked about for, like, I would even say longer. I mean, 06, that's a really good one. Yeah, 2008. You know, I started in 2007 with the Head Start and ECAP Association. We were talking about all of these things then and trying to lay the ground.
Katie, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
April, could you possibly move over back into the main room since you have control over the interpreters, and I can record this breakout group here?
I actually did hit the record button.
Oh, okay. Is April here or did April go back?
I don't know.
April, are you here?
I don't think April's in this room.
Oh, okay, never mind. She got my text. We're good. In that case, apologies. Katie, go ahead, keep going.
That's okay. Some of the pieces of what we have accomplished in the last however many years have been decades in the making, and I don't want to forget all of that work that's been happening in all of these years with the Early Learning Plan and the Department of Early Learning and all of those things. But for our purposes here, I'm really talking about this conceptual framework that we have in Fair Start for Kids, where the legislature comes up with a big early learning package and tries to put in the stuff that we are agreed upon as in a coalition. So we're gonna do a little timeline, and I would invite anybody who is on here to pitch in whenever you have an idea or something that's not covered, or because you guys are the advocates, and you guys have your own perspectives from each of your locations or organizations or personal experience. And I would invite this to be a collective experience as well. So I'm going to kick this off, and we're going to kick this off in, and I'm looking at the chat too, you guys, that we have, you know, really thinking about what how we continue the momentum and how do we not get advocacy fatigue and all those sorts of things. And so we'll look through that as well. All right, so let's see if my clicker works here. Click, there we go. One of the things that I like to think about, and one of the things that we've really had to adapt over the years, is thinking about who is involved in the advocacy, who is at the table and who is not, and how do we adapt along the way. These are just some opening questions as we go in. What kind of successes did we have along the way, and what kind of failures, and how did we adjust and move forward? I'm hoping that as you come out of this session today, that you will be thinking about each new advocacy activity that you do in this same way, where you are thinking who's at the table and who's not. Can we have small successes and small failures, and then learn from those and move forward? Because I do think that that is one of the clear messages of the way that Fair Start for Kids moved along. Okay. So, oh, this is the whole thing, and I'm gonna move to this. All right. So I started my timeline in 2014-15 because it was the first really major large-scale early learning package that the legislature accomplished in 2015. How many of you, put your hands up or whatever if you remember the, if you were part of that early start conversation back in 2014-15? Or chat or whatever. This was, I see some raised hands in there. This was really the first time where the coalition, all of the various people who are in the ELA coalition and the lawmakers got together. Ruth Kagi was really a big leader in this, to try to figure out how you accomplish some of these things to both improve quality and access to early learning. So for those of you who are familiar with Early Start, what did we achieve? What were the good parts? Anybody remember way back when, 6-7 years ago, to Early Start? Funded early achievers. Yeah, it really kind of created early achievers. It was the first time that we had a sort of systematic way of quality improvement and support funds. Anything else? What didn't work? Funds for scholarships, yeah. What didn't work about it? Don't be shy. I mean, I think if we look at the whole limited eligibility, yep, and really not enough money, right? Like we did not have enough support for providers. We put into place a system where you had you were part of Early Achievers and you got coaching, and that was really great, and you got some supports for that. But you probably didn't get enough money to be able to sustain quality, to be able to pay your teachers, all of those things, right? Every little increase in working connections was incremental, same with ECAP. And so all of a sudden you have this big quality structure, you have the new licensing standards and all of that, and you're trying to figure out how do you put that into place in a system with a broken market, right? All right. So from 2015 to 2019, we really had to try to implement Early Start. We had to get the Early Achiever system working. We did negotiated rulemaking to establish all new rules for licensing of childcare and ECAP. They did all kinds of, they required childcare to be part of early achievers in order to be eligible for the childcare subsidy. And they had new requirements around stackable certificates for classroom staff and directors, all kinds of new rules. Some comments in the chat here about the barriers for professionals in regards to requirements, the teachers leaving the field after they got their degrees. You know, for years, the unfortunate situation has been that as soon as you get the higher degree, you move to a different job, right? So childcare loses their teachers to ECAP, and ECAP loses their teachers to Head Start, and Head Start loses their teachers to the school district. But now we're kind of losing our teachers to Target and all those things. It's due to pay. Yeah, it's absolutely due to pay. Yep. Samantha, you're absolutely right. Although, of course, it's also a stressful job. I think many of you know, burnout and all the rest. Yeah, so, you know, there was a lot of advocacy in the community, right? There was a lot of complaining. There was a lot of involvement in various work groups. There were a lot of discussions at the coalition level and within all of our respective organizations about what needs to come next. And there were a lot of conversations with key lawmakers about what needs to happen in order to actually develop a field that is stable, where people are paid sufficiently, where children have access, all of those things that we know are so critical to the long-term success of our state. And there was research and money coming in from other places, right? From philanthropy, from the feds, all that kind of thing too. Yeah, staff are underpaid. Oops, I don't know how I managed to get there. Hold on. Tina says that her son would discuss with her when his teachers shared having 2 or 3 additional jobs, including teaching. Yeah, it's not great. So after all that conversation and all that work in the community and a lot of involvement from key lawmakers and from other organizations and funders to try to figure out what the next step is, in 2020, the first version of Fair Start for Kids was introduced. And, you know, it really looked at a lot of those things that were missing in Early Start. I mean, there was a real focus in Early Start on quality. There was a lot of concern in the legislature that the state was paying for low quality services, and that those low quality services were going to the children who needed high quality services the most. There's a lot of privilege and judgment involved in some of these conversations. I think we would agree, and their perception of what quality is and what our perception of quality is often differ. But to be clear, that was a real focus of Early Start. And so when we shifted to Fair Start for Kids conversation with all of these people involved, we really started talking about these other pieces. How do we make it more flexible for families, for providers? How do we make sure it's equitable in terms of providers of color, families of color? How do we make sure that access increases and the burden on parents and providers is less? How do we make sure that this is an ongoing concern with a living wage and that it's not as volatile as early learning is? I am sure many of you, if you are running childcare, or if you are part of a Head Start or an ECAP program, or if you have children in those groups, have seen a high level of turnover often, because until we strengthen that foundation, we can't do it. And Fair Start was really an attempt to start to do that, right? And the first version of Fair Start made that effort. But guess what? It did not go anywhere, because lawmakers did not want to vote for taxes. They never do. It was during an election year. And we just could not come to an agreement. And there wasn't 100% agreement even among us about what should be prioritized, how should this work, etc. Any thoughts about the first version of Fair Start for Kids and how that went for you? The key
But like we heard a lot of, there wasn't enough money. There's just not enough money to do this. You're asking too much.
That's exactly right, right? I mean, how do you get lawmakers to prioritize something that they have not prioritized in the past, right? I mean, one of the messages that we kept using is that early learning is like 1% of the state budget, right? 1%. And still they were like, oh, you want to raise that to 2%? What, are you guys crazy? We can't do that. That's not feasible. So yeah, Dari heard a lot of where should we take the money from. I will say that that is one of my most hated conversations with lawmakers, where they ask you, well, of course this is a priority, but somewhere has to cut. How do what do you think we should get rid of? And honestly, I usually say, I am not the expert here. I don't know. I just know that this is my highest priority and you guys should be funding it. Yeah. All right. So, and then every time we have a setback like this, it's important that we really think through and have kind of a after action report kind of process. In the military, when they have an exercise, whether it goes well or poorly, they have an after action report. And that's kind of what we have to do in advocacy too. Every year after the session, we need to think through what worked, what didn't work, what can we do differently, who else needs to be at the table, who wielded the power during the session, who do we need to work more with, who do we need to work less with. All of those things, and so that we can reset and maybe change our strategy, add players, all of the rest of the things, right? Samantha says that she really wants to advocate for social and mental health development for early learners. But when you look at the bigger picture, high turnover with our teachers, that is a huge part going into the mental health and social development aspect of kids. It is so true. I never even really thought about that, Samantha, but yeah, that lack of a consistent caregiver in the early learning setting actually does add to the mental health challenges and emotional development of children as well. Could not agree more. And that's one of the big, it's one of our biggest priorities at my organization too, is around strengthening early childhood mental health supports as well. And in a way that those providers are reflective of the ethnicity and race of the children that they are and families that they're working with. I think that that's a huge problem with mental health here in Washington. Natasha says she sees a need to educate people about the tax that we implemented to pay for Fair Start for Kids. Oh, so you're getting calls, Natasha, from groups trying to figure out how to overturn it. Yeah.
Yes, and they're long and convoluted and annoying.
Yeah, I am no tax expert, and it's a big frustration when basically your goals fail because of tax issues that you don't entirely understand. And that's actually one of those things where how do we figure out what is the right mechanism for getting something funded, right? That was a big part of the process for the for Fair Start, right? Is figuring out how do you fund it in a way that will actually get passed. I think I went backwards. Oh, all right. So, okay, so this is actually 2021 after the session. We went back to the drawing board. We did that, right? We tried to figure out who's leading. We figured out why we failed. We did some reflection and planning to go into 2021 with something that would pass. So Fair Start for Kids 2.2 or 2.0 was introduced in 2021. And some of the things that happened was, for example, in 2020, there was a lot of disagreement between the House and the Senate about what this bill should do. So they actually introduced separate bills in 2020, right? And there was just a lot of disagreement between the two houses about how they should proceed. The Senate was much more expansive about it. The House was less, because the House thought that they could get something accomplished. They thought that it was not feasible to do the bigger version. So there were political disagreements, there were policy disagreements within the legislature. And one of the critical elements during that whole 2020 was ongoing meetings that included both House members and Senate members and advocates every week or two. Gosh, there were a lot of meetings, and to talk about how we could all get on the same page going into the session. And that was really critical. And we got it passed. Congratulations, everybody. And I'll be honest, I actually think that we had really laid the groundwork. All of us here on this call and beyond had really laid the groundwork with all those conversations, with bringing additional players, with having funding from outside, with having lawmakers who were super passionate. But I also think that it might not have passed in the way that it did if it had not been for the pandemic. Because all of a sudden the state had a whole bunch of extra money. And some of those questions about how you fund it, particularly during the first couple of years where you're waiting for the lawsuit, went away because they had federal money in hand to be able to support this. And so some of it, when we get something big passed, is luck. I think that there are terrible, terrible things about this pandemic, but I honestly think that one of the best things that came out of the pandemic is Fair Start for Kids Act. That's my own, that's my own assessment. Might not be true. But now we have to think about what comes next, right? So we could see from early start that the way that it was implemented, the strictness of the changes to licensing, some of the issues around early achievers and the way that that was implemented, the lack of attention to certain parts of the system, right? The not enough money, the not enough training, all that kind of stuff. You know, that actually led to Fair Start, but also we need to think through as we implement Fair Start, what are we missing in Fair Start, right? What are the additional components of things that we have to pass in the future? What is happening in Fair Start, and how do we make sure that it is successful and implemented in the way that we think will work for the community? And when I say the community, I mean the parents and the grandparents and the providers and the staff and everybody, right? What administrative advocacy do we need to do? Because political advocacy is the sexy part where we get to have lawmaker meetings, and administrative advocacy is the not sexy part where we go to endless meetings on Zoom to talk about what the plan is and how does DCYF do this and how can we get compromises here. And developing those relationships with the state government and making sure that they are inviting people who, you know, represent the community and who are parents and who are members of tribes, and that they are making sure that they are inclusive when they're having these conversations. And what additional political advocacy do we have to worry about next, right? This year is kind of a midterm year, so we don't have as much on our plate, but we're gonna need to be asking for a lot of money for staff soon, right? Unless that Build Back Better comes in and we have a lot of extra money coming from the feds, we're gonna need to think about how do we make sure that we can solidify the early learning landscape, stop the bleed and the turnover, and create a strong market and, you know, quality outcomes for kids and families. So that's sort of where we are now. So what are thoughts that folks have about how you can get involved at this point? And I'm looking at the chat here. They don't always realize what children need. I will also say that one of the real benefits, and it was mentioned today earlier, of the pandemic is online testimony. It has been really awesome to be able to see just the breadth of people being participating in testifying in Olympia and telling their story. I really think that that helped us a lot this last year, and hopefully moving forward that will still be an option. Tara is worried that DCYF doesn't have the infrastructure in place to implement the pieces of Fair Start for Kids. Yeah. 80 says, usually state legislation doesn't include funds for parent training, empowerment, leadership. Kids come with parents. So if we want to help kids, we need to work with parents. Absolutely. Samantha says, as parents, we love our kids and want the best for them. Instead of shaming parents for what they aren't doing or are doing wrong, there needs to be more education and support resources as to the best ways to teach parents. Natasha goes back to educating the populace about what the capital gains tax really is and who it affects. Kevin says, attend town halls and talk to your legislator. The PPP is being invested in Pierce County, free for any parents. And good, Sakura and Natasha are going to talk about the capital gains tax. Good. Megan talks about we can't stop building relationships. So I want to underscore that one, actually. Thank you, Megan, for mentioning that. So a lot of times when we have a big victory, we pat ourselves in the back, and then we don't pay enough attention to the implementation, and we don't continue with those relationships. But we're never going to be done. I just want to say that right now, right? We are never going to have a system that works for everybody, and we are going to be in a continual effort to develop a system that is better for kids, better for families, more equitable, better for providers. And every year we will try to move towards that. But what that means is that we have to meet with our lawmakers every year, not just in the year that we have a big package, right? If you have not met with your legislators, you should give them a call. And you know when the good time to call is? It is now, but it's also during the off season when they have more time, right? Where you can sit down with them, get to know them. They give you 30-minute meetings instead of 15-minute meetings, and you can get to know them and without an ask, right? Because, you know, sometimes it's great for lawmakers to meet with you and say, you know, these are some of the things that we're looking at and considering. We don't have an ask right now, but we want to hear from you about what's important to you. We want to tell you how things are going with the implementation of Fair Start. These are all good things to be doing during the off season, and during the session, of course, we have our agenda, and it's good to make appointments for that too. Tara says a big part of what she can do is educate her community about new opportunities. That actually speaks to one of the ways that we make Fair Start successful is making sure everybody takes us up on the offer of expanded access. You know, right now we have a whole lot of space left in our system because we don't have enough providers, because we don't have enough staff, and you know, parents are worried, and so they're not sending kids to childcare, and the childcare system at DCYF, and this speaks to Tara's earlier comment about whether or not they have a good enough infrastructure. You know, parents are on the phone for 4 hours and it takes 2 months to get approved and all that kind of thing, right? So figuring out how we can lean on them on some of those issues that affect implementation is another issue. Let's see, educate voters. Everybody wants to know about the taxes. And so maybe that's something, you know, one of the things that we're thinking about is what are the next steps and how do we strengthen all of our advocates here? And so I think we may be having some follow-up opportunities. And I think that one of those things is should really be around our tax system and how do we pay for early learning and what do we need to think about, right? Because I think that's something that we're not experts in and which is always a little confusing. Dari lives where legislators feel like the best place for kids is home with mom until age 5. Ideas on how to approach this mindset. Any thoughts, guys?
Not every mom gets to stay home. What about those of us who have to go to work to pay our bills?
It's a hard one, Dari. You know, because you have had many a meeting that some people you are never going to convince. And one of the things that I always tell parents is that you will have lawmakers who you can convince to your side of the of whatever issue it is. You will have lawmakers who are already on board and will help you and be champions. And then you will have lawmakers who will never help you. But you should meet with all of them because sometimes you want that one who will never agree with you to just not speak out on the floor against your bill, right? Because sometimes just getting them to be quiet about it and them knowing that there are people in their district who care about this thing that will be pissed off if they are loud about it is enough for that person, right? So advocacy is not just about talking to your champions, it's also talking about people who you don't agree with. Let's see here. I'm looking at, we have a 4-minute warning. Let's see, what time is it here? Figure out the time. Oh yeah, we have about 3 minutes, I think. I've got so many messages. You guys are so awesome. I'm trying to even scroll through these. Advocate accelerated and simplified staff development, easy licensing, expanded license options, fast track because of pandemic, and surplus that has immediate economic benefits. That's a great. All right. I think I have one more slide here where I just sort of synopsized the some of those key questions. Who's at the table and who isn't? Who are your champions and how do you get more? And you know, the corollary there is who is your opposition and how do you get less, right? Because you have to play both sides of that. And sometimes that actually then circles back to who is at the table, right? If I have opposition and maybe it would help me to have business people at the table, then how do I get those people involved in early learning, right? So that I can minimize my opposition and maximize my support. How do you build in reflection and relationship building? How do you do that after action report and make sure that the people who are there are the ones who have a unique perspective? How do you address conflicts within the community? We do not always agree on the priorities in the early learning space. And sometimes it's a zero-sum game. You might have legislators tell you all the time, we have X amount of money in the early learning bucket or box. And then, you have to figure out how you're going to divvy that up. And how do you fund this work, right? And how do you support parents? And I want to mention about this importance of having people with lived experience involved in all of these pieces of this decision-making process, not just testifying, but at the table, doing the planning, talking about what the policies are, talking about implementation, and lived experience as parents, it's providers, it's teachers, it's family support people, it's all the people who are out there. And this year we have a bill that would enable the state to compensate those people for their incredible expertise and importance. So that's going to be a big priority for us, is getting that bill passed so that parents don't have to sacrifice financial or otherwise to have a voice in implementation and in policy. What other questions? What other questions are part of a long-term advocacy effort?
Well, I would love an answer to the how do you fund the work? Like, how do you get, a Katie or like a ambassador manager to like help these parents and people even come together and manage that time? Like, there's a ton of logistics in that. So how does that work, and where does that kind of funding even come from?
Yeah, I work for a small nonprofit, and it's when we started, there were 2 of us, and now there's 4 of us, plus a whole bunch of parent coordinators who are on this call. Several, Sonia and Natasha, both work with us with parent ambassadors. There might be other folks on here. Natasha is our brand new tribal coordinator. And it is part of the advocacy work with lawmakers and with coalitions is about relationship building, and part of getting money is also about relationship building, and it takes a long time. But it's also about connecting to organizations who might have that money and those connections. And yeah, I'm not sure who else thinks that they have a solution to that question.
Katie, I wanted to add that it does really take time, and it takes relationships. I can't stress that enough. And all of the attempts, and it only happens once a year that you can like get in there and make that movement, and just a little bit of movement goes a long way. And then never doubt that a small group of people can make change, because indeed that's all that ever has.
Yeah, so they're about to bump us, and I've put the PowerPoint in the chat if anybody wants that. And I really want to thank everybody for being here and for being so active in the chat. I hope I didn't miss anything critical in here as I was trying to scroll through and present simultaneously. Sometimes that's a little challenging, but yeah, I really appreciate all of your passion, and yeah, thank you for being here. And I look forward to seeing you at many tables and many advocacy opportunities this year and in the future. And Doreen, you're with PAVE. I love PAVE so much. I just want to say that. We often have PAVE
Thank
come
you.
and talk to our parents. Really, really love it. So, you know, I bow to all of the other organizations who do this work, and thank you for your work. And yeah, thanks everybody. Bye. And I guess I'll stop the